20 million birds were released into the wild, not to soar, but to serve as soldiers. Not pigeons, not chickens. Quail. Tiny, delicate, nearly invisible. Yet in 2025, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood beneath the burning Sahel sun and declared them the frontline fighters in a war for survival. They are sovereignty with wings, he said. And with that, trucks arrived, crates were opened, and flocks scattered into millet fields, deserts, and villages. No pesticides, no foreign loans, just fragile wings against famine, hunger, and dependency. Western analysts mocked it. Radio hosts joked. Memes flooded social media. But in Burkina Faso, children chased the birds. Mothers gathered eggs. And farmers called them tiny blessings. What kind of revolution begins with a bird no bigger than your hand? And why? Just months later, they were foreign corporations secretly signing contracts to claim the profits. Was this the beginning of food freedom, or the latest chapter in Africa feeding the world while starving at home? When Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked onto the podium in Ouagadougou that March afternoon, a few expected anything more than a ceremonial speech. The heat clung to every face, and hope was thin in the air. People came out of duty, not belief. But then, he spoke. We will release 20 million birds not to entertain, but to defend, not in cages, but in combat, and they will win. There was silence, confusion, a few chuckles. Surely, this was metaphor. Surely, this was symbolic. But he wasn't talking about drones or fighter jets. He was talking about quail tiny, fragile birds, no heavier than a clenched fist. Traoré called them the soldiers of sovereignty. He said they would fight hunger, devour pests, lay eggs, feed children, and rewrite history to the world. It sounded like madness. But in Burkina Faso, something began to shift. Within weeks, trucks painted in the national colors rolled into rural provinces. Each carried hundreds of crates filled with chirping, restless quail chicks. The first releases were treated like ceremonies. In dusty villages across the Sahel, elders gathered, children chanted, mothers clapped. The crates were opened, and the flocks burst forth tiny, determined, chaotic. Wings fluttered through the millet stalks, dust swirled, laughter broke out. And just like that, the quail revolution began. But this was no PR stunt. Behind the scenes, logistics teams worked with military precision. 3 new hatcheries had been built across key regions, each producing hundreds of thousands of chicks per month. Agricultural brigades were dispatched with clipboards and data sheets. Quotas were issued to schools, women's groups, and village committees. A national tracking system was launched to monitor egg yields, meat, weight, and survival rates. The numbers spoke loudly. Within just 6 months, 5 million quail had been released across more than 80 000 hectares of farmland. From the very start, the images defied expectation. Villages once forgotten by modern policy stood beside crates of birds, helping them scatter into fields long ravaged by grasshoppers. Children began waking up early, not to beg or wait for handouts, but to check the nests. Women gathered eggs into baskets and brought them to market. Some families even shared boiled quail eggs at community feasts, the first protein some elders had seen in weeks. Zalaif, a farmer from Yako, was one of the first to speak to the press. He said, "If these birds save my harvest, I will name my son after them." In Ouagadougou, though, the response was colder. Intellectuals mocked the project on radio shows. Online, memes spread of quail wearing military helmets, of politicians holding eggs instead of microphones. Headlines in French newspapers sneered, "Burkina Faso bets on birds." Analysts in Washington dismissed it as populist pageantry. London tabloids scoffed at birds against hunger. But further east, the tone was different. Agricultural journals in China and India began publishing technical breakdowns. In Asia, where quail eggs were already a daily staple, the numbers made sense. Quick to reproduce, cheap to feed, fast to mature, high in iron and protein. The question wasn't, why quail? It was, why didn't Africa do this sooner? Mali and Niger sent quiet delegations to observe, Could the birds that scurried through Burkina Faso's fields be the solution to their own locust plagues? What began as satire was starting to look like strategy. But for Captain Traoré, this was never about global approval. It was about reclaiming control, not with tanks or treaties, but with biology. Sovereignty, he argued, could not be imported. It had to be hatched, nurtured, and grown from within. Still, questions hovered like the dust in the air. Could these birds survive hawks, snakes, drought, and disease? Would their eggs and meat stay in the hands of ordinary Burkinabé or be snapped up by foreign buyers? As had happened so many times before, this wasn't the first time Africa had fed the world and starved at home. So, as 5 million birds disappeared into the fields, another storm was quietly gathering. Whispers began to spread, not about the birds themselves, but about where the profits might go. Who was already negotiating contracts behind closed doors? What was being promised, signed, and sealed before the first full harvest? The revolution had begun not with a bang, but with a flutter. But before it could fly, something, or someone, would try to clip its wings. Why quail? Why not chickens, goats, or cattle animals that fill more plates, more often, across the continent? To understand the answer, we must first understand the war that Burkina Faso has been fighting for decades. A war, not of guns and bombs, but of calories, protein, and sovereignty. Burkina Faso, like much of the Sahel, has been locked in a slow, painful struggle against hunger. Droughts have scorched the land. Grasshoppers and locusts have devoured crops. Rising food prices have emptied markets, and international aid has often arrived too late or come with strings too tight. Livestock, while valuable, are expensive to raise. Chickens require grain feed that many villages can't afford. Cattle need land and water that no longer exist. Imports of meat and eggs have kept cities fed, but drained national budgets and deepened dependency. Captain Traoré understood this brutal math, so he turned to a creature most had overlooked: the quail. They mature in just 6 weeks. Females start laying eggs by day. 45. A single bird can lay over 250 eggs per year. They eat less, drink less, breed fast, thrive quietly. Unlike chickens, quail don't need elaborate coops or industrial feed. They scavenge, they peck, they survive. And in the numbers Traoré proposed 20 million strong, they could change the equation of food production in the Sahel. Government agricultural reports, backed by FAO studies, confirmed the logic. In controlled trials, quail farming reduced protein production costs by nearly 40% compared to traditional poultry. That number alone shook policy rooms. But there was more. Their eggs, tiny and speckled, contain higher iron and vitamin A content than chicken eggs. For a nation battling child, malnutrition, and anemia, these were not just eggs. They were medicine. In one pilot village, families who consumed quail eggs 3 times a week saw visible improvements in children's weight and school attendance after just 3 months. Clinics began reporting fewer cases of fatigue, dizziness, and stunted growth. One village nurse said, "These eggs did more than vitamins ever could. They're affordable, local, and they work." But the strategy went beyond nutrition. Quail eat grasshoppers, locusts, and mosquitoes. In short, they are flying pest control. Where pesticides fail or harm the soil, quail succeed silently, organically, efficiently. In test regions, millet farmers reported 20 to 30% fewer crop losses in fields where quail had been released. Some called them living pesticides. Others said they were angels with feathers. The birds were serving double duty, feeding the people and protecting the fields. Still, the government wasn't blind to economics. Traoré's inner circle had another calculation in mind: export. In Asia, particularly Japan, China, and the Philippines, quail eggs are consumed by the billions each year. They're not exotic, they're everyday food. Street stalls serve skewered quail eggs. Grocery stores stock cartons by the dozen. Burkina Faso saw an opportunity. If it could scale up production, it could become Africa's first major exporter of quail eggs and meat, tapping into a multi-billion-dollar market. One agriculture minister put it clearly: if we cannot control oil, or gold, or coffee, let us at least control our protein. It was a bold vision, a protein economy rooted not in Western factories, but in African backyards. But boldness always invites risk. Critics raised hard questions. Could such fragile birds survive the unforgiving Sahel heat? Would snake bites, hawk attacks, and disease outbreaks wipe out entire flocks? And what about greed? Who would truly benefit if the industry exploded? Would the profits stay in rural villages, building clinics and schools, or be siphoned off by foreign investors? As had happened so many times before, for now, the numbers brought optimism. By the end of year one, over 50 million eggs had been collected. Quail meat-filled village markets. Women who once sold firewood now sold boiled quail skewers. Children walked to school with full bellies. The answer to why quail was no longer theoretical. It was visible, it was edible, and it was powerful. Quail were no longer just birds. They were weapons against hunger, against poverty, and against the lie that Africa must always depend on others to eat. But just as hope soared, new shadows emerged. Behind the scenes, contracts were being signed, foreign hands were knocking, and what was meant to be a revolution of the people was at risk of becoming just another product on someone else's plate. Behind the contracts and the controversy, they called it a revolution. They called it sovereignty with wings. But behind the songs and ceremonies, something darker was brewing. In late 2026, a leak hit the national press like thunder. Confidential documents stamped and signed revealed what no one had dared imagine. Foreign agribusiness conglomerates, based in Europe and Asia, had quietly signed contracts with Burkina Faso's Ministry of Commerce. The terms: in exchange for early investments in hatcheries and feed infrastructure, these corporations would receive exclusive rights to purchase 60% of the country's quail, egg, and meat exports at discounted rates for the next 15 years. The public was stunned. The very birds released into local fields by villagers, students, and soldiers, the same eggs that mothers collected to feed their families, were now being sold off. En masse, behind closed doors, radio shows exploded with anger. We release the birds. We raise them. We protect them. And now foreigners take the eggs. In Ouagadougou, protests erupted. Placards showed tiny quail trapped inside dollar signs. Street murals depicted Captain Traoré shaking hands with faceless men in suits while villagers looked on. Empty-handed, it was betrayal. Or at least, that's how it felt. And then came the footage. Grainy videos surfaced shot by villagers with old phones showing refrigerated trucks, escorted by guards, pulling out of depots late at night. Each truck stacked with pallets of eggs and boxes of processed quail meat. Their destinations: border crossings, ports, cargo routes to foreign markets. One mother, whose village had released birds only months earlier, cried on live radio. They told us this was for our children, but I saw those trucks, and I cannot follow them. Government spokespeople scrambled. They claimed the contracts were necessary to attract foreign capital, that without international buyers, the entire program would collapse under its own weight. But they refused to disclose the full details. Silence became suspicion, and suspicion turned into rage. Burkina Faso's history, like so many African nations, is filled with tales of promise turned poison. Gold, cocoa, oil, cotton, always the same pattern. A local resource, a foreign partner, a secret deal, and a people left behind. The fear now was simple. Would quail become just another entry in that long, painful list? Even supporters of the program began asking hard questions. Would villagers still receive a fair share of profits? Would hatcheries remain locally owned, or be swallowed by international companies once production scaled? Would foreign corporations, those who had once laughed at the idea, now reap the harvest of a people's sacrifice? For Captain Traoré, the stakes had never been higher. His face had sold this revolution. His words had inspired it. And now, those same supporters were turning to him not with applause, but with accusations. Did we hatch this future only to hand it over? Under pressure, Traoré responded, the only way he knew how, with action. In early 2027, he appeared on national television, flanked by engineers, farmers, and women from rural cooperatives. With calm defiance, he announced the launch of Burkina Faso's first national quail processing and packaging facility, located near Bobo Dioulasso. It would cold pack eggs, process meat, and develop powdered quail protein for schools, hospitals, and export. He held up a carton stamped Made in Faso. The foreigners may invest, he said, but the sovereignty belongs here. From now on, we export not raw eggs, but dignity in a box. The crowd roared. Within 6 months, the facility was running at half capacity, producing 150,000 cartons of eggs per week and 20 tons of meat monthly. Shipments marked Burkina Faso Premium began appearing in Lagos, Abidjan, and even Dubai. It was a powerful counterpunch, a reminder that sovereignty wasn't just a slogan. It could be built, boxed, and shipped with pride. But still, the question lingered. Who controlled the supply chains? Who set the prices? Were the foreign contracts really cancelled, or just buried deeper? One analyst warned, "We have changed the packaging, but have we changed the power?" And so, even as cartons filled with hope rolled out of warehouses, another truth fluttered just behind them, quieter, but impossible to ignore. It's not about the eggs. It's about who owns them. Stories from the ground. Before the contracts, before the headlines, before the world even knew what was happening, there were the people. The farmers, the mothers, the children. Those who didn't read policy papers or study protein charts. They just lived with hunger, every single day. And when the quail arrived, they saw not politics but possibility. Awa, a 7-year-old single mother from Kurugu, tells her story with the calm of someone who has survived more than she will ever say. Her husband left for Europe 5 years ago. He never returned. With 2 young children and no steady income, she sold peanuts and cassava by the roadside. Some days, they ate once. Some days, not at all. When her village was assigned a flock of 5,000 quail, Awa didn't hesitate. She volunteered for the village cooperative. At first, she was unsure. She had never cared for birds. But the training came quickly. Feeding, nesting, cleaning, collecting eggs. Within 3 months, her household was gathering over 500 eggs a week. She kept half for her children boiled, fried, even ground into porridge. The rest, she sold at market. She tripled her income in a season. For the first time, her children slept with full bellies. Her eldest son told his teacher, "We eat strength every morning." Soon, Awa used her savings to build a small roadside stall. She began grilling quail skewers, seasoned and sizzling, and selling them to passers-by. She added sweet tea and boiled maize. Her stand became a local fixture. Stability was no longer a dream. It was lunch. And Awa was not alone. Across Burkina Faso, thousands of women stepped into the economy not with charity, but with birds in their hands. Quail didn't require vast land or expensive infrastructure. A few cages, some feed, and regular care. That was enough. And that was revolutionary. For women long locked out of ownership, this was a ladder. In the village of Dedougou, a grandmother named Mariam oversaw a women's collective, managing 12,000 quail. Her team, all women over 50, widows, survivors, warriors of the land. The men thought we were joking. She laughed. Now we sell to them every Friday. Eggs, meat, even feathers. In provinces once haunted by malnutrition, school clinics began reporting fewer cases. Teachers noticed better attendance. Markets grew louder. More color, more repride. In the town of Yako, children who once sold plastic bags in the street now sold boiled quail eggs, 2 for a coin. They became little entrepreneurs, managing inventory, negotiating prices. One 1-year-old told a journalist, "These eggs are my school fees." And then there was Salif. His story had gone viral after he promised to name his child after the birds if they saved his harvest. Now, 2 years later, he stands in front of 2 new grain silos, built with cooperative funds from quail sales. His wife employs 3 women at their egg sorting station. And yes, his youngest child is named Kuti, after Quail, the French word for quail. He holds up a basket of speckled eggs, smiling wide. These small birds changed my whole life. They didn't just feed us, they gave us purpose. This was the heart of the revolution. Not the exports, not the contracts, not the debates in air-conditioned rooms, but ordinary people in forgotten villages. reclaiming dignity one egg at a time. By the end of year 3, over 15 million quail had been released. National production surpassed 500 million eggs annually, and 50 plank, 000 tons of meat. Economists valued the industry at $1, $2 to $2 billion. Rivaling Burkina Faso's cotton sector, malnutrition dropped by 15% in some provinces. Food import declined, and more importantly, hope returned. Still, the tension persisted. Foreign contracts still loomed. Price controls were debated, and rumors spread that middlemen were already positioning to dominate distribution chains. But for people like Awa, Mariam, and Salif, the question wasn't whether the revolution was perfect. It was whether it had changed their lives. And that answer was clear. Quail were no longer symbols. They were sustenance, security, sovereignty in the smallest, most fragile form. Awa summed it up best. They told us we were too small. But so are the birds. And look what they've done. Exporting sovereignty or selling it. When Burkina Faso announced its intention to export quail, eggs, and meat to the world, a few took it seriously. Quail, from the desert, competing with Europe's industrial farms and Asia's established markets. But within 2 years, things changed. The first cartons, labeled Burkina Faso Premium Quail, landed in Lagos, then Abidjan, then Dubai. In Morocco and Singapore, independent labs certified the eggs met and in some cases exceeded international standards. Rich in iron, high in omega-3, naturally organic. In blind taste tests in Nairobi and Accra, chefs couldn't tell them. Apart from European imports, in fact, some preferred them. A phrase emerged in West African markets. Desert eggs, real power. And just like that, the global game began. Asian importers, already familiar with quail, saw the potential in Japan and the Philippines, where quail eggs are. Street food staples, buyers made inquiries. Chinese journals praised the program as the most efficient protein strategy to emerge from Africa. Meanwhile, in Europe, the response was colder. Trade groups in France and Italy issued statements questioning the sanitary control standards of Sahelian hatcheries. French media ran sarcastic editorials with headlines like "Eggs of the Sand." Burkina Faso dreams big. One op-ed sneered, "Let them eat eggs if they survive the heat." Burkina Faso hit back with numbers. Over 500 million eggs produced annually. Woosha, 000 tons of meat. And over $40 million in direct export revenue from domestically controlled facilities. Not foreign aid. Not handouts. Revenue. Officials presented receipts, contracts, results, and most powerful of all stories, photos of women in white coats working factory lines, villagers depositing earnings into rural banks, schools built with quail cooperative funds. This was no longer theory. It was trade. It was sovereignty. Packaged, labeled, and shipped. But not everyone celebrated. Environmentalists warned that scaling up hatcheries was draining local water supplies. That imported feed could soon replace local production, creating a new dependency, and that disease outbreaks, like the Newcastle epidemic of 2029, could wipe out entire supply chains overnight. Then came the middlemen. Private logistics firms, many with foreign partners, began buying up rights to transport, store, and distribute quail products. Some began acquiring stakes in village hatcheries. Quietly, strategically, the question returned like a shadow. Was Burkina Faso exporting sovereignty or selling it? Captain Traoré, ever the orator, addressed this head-on. At the International Protein Summit in Nairobi, he stood before a crowd of diplomats, economists, and skeptics, holding a carton of Faso eggs. For too long, Africa exported raw materials. We sent cocoa and imported chocolate. We sent gold and wore plastic watches. We sent coffee and drank bitterness. He paused, then raised the carton. Not this time. This is not an egg. This is policy. This is planning. This is power. The room applauded. But applause does not control markets. Burkina Faso still faced pricing pressure from older producers, European regulations on imports, and the ever-present risk of monopolies forming within its own borders. Some cooperatives began reporting delays in payments. Others said foreign buyers were demanding exclusivity in return for bulk orders. And always, the fear that the profits would float upward, while the farmers, once again, stood watching. Still, the momentum remained strong. Mali and Niger began replicating the model. Ghana expressed interest in forming a Sahelian quail alliance to coordinate disease control, export logistics, and price stability. Talks began on forming a West African protein bloc. In Asia, Burkina Faso's eggs reached high-end food shops in Singapore, Tokyo, and Seoul. Branded as Sahel Select, they became a novelty, a delicacy from the edge of the Sahara. One food blogger in Korea wrote, "Who knew revolution could come in a shell so small?" But back home, in rural villages, the people watched carefully. They remembered the cotton fields, the gold mines, the promises. They had lived the cycle. Resource, boom, foreign hands, collapse. Would this be different? Could Burkina Faso keep control as the world's hunger circled its deserts? Or would sovereignty, once again, slip through its fingers disguised in profit, wrapped in plastic, and shipped across oceans? The game was global now, and the stakes were higher than ever. The final test. By 2029, the numbers told one story, but nature told another. Burkina Faso had released over 20 million quail. Hatcheries were producing hundreds of thousands of birds monthly. Exports were flowing. Malnutrition had dropped. Rural incomes had doubled in some provinces. The desert had been pushed back. But the desert is never done. That same year, a sudden outbreak of Newcastle disease struck 3 northern provinces. Despite aggressive vaccination campaigns, it spread fast. Within weeks, over 10% of the national quail population was wiped out. For families whose livelihood depended on the birds, it was devastation. Local newspapers declared, "The desert strikes back," and critics rushed in. This was always a fantasy, they said. Too fragile, too fast, too ambitious. But what happened next proved something more powerful than profit, or policy, or even protein. The people responded, not with despair, not with blame, but with coordination. Village cooperatives organized emergency recovery plans. Hatcheries increased output. Government reserves of chicks quietly stockpiled over the past 2 years were released. Veterinary teams trained thousands in new prevention protocols. Within 3 months, replacement flocks were already pecking through millet fields. Eggs returned to market stalls. The sound of life fluttered again. The system had been tested, and it held. In Ouagadougou, journalists asked Captain Traoré if the quail revolution had finally failed. He smiled, then answered, "If it failed, why are we still standing?" What had started as a fragile dream had become something durable, something flexible, something real. In economic terms, the numbers were updated. The quail industry, even after the outbreak, was valued at over $1.8 billion. Food imports dropped another 12%. More than 50,000. Jobs were directly tied to the industry, not just in farming, but in transport, marketing, processing, and export. In social terms, the shift was cultural. The phrase "sovereignty with wings" was no longer poetic. It was printed on signs outside village hatcheries, on skull walls, on the packaging exported to Asia. A new generation was growing up not only eating quail, but understanding its meaning. In a village outside Koudougou, a young girl named Fanta stood before her classroom, holding a basket of eggs. "These are not just eggs," she said. "They are our freedom." The class clapped. The teacher wept. Across the Sahel, governments began coordinating for the first time in decades. Mali expanded its hatchery network. Niger established cross-border disease control zones. A protein corridor was mapped, stretching from Senegal to Chad, where quail could be bred, traded, and exported under a unified African framework. The world noticed. Burkina Faso was no longer an asterisk on trade reports. It was a case study, a headline, a model. From Tokyo to Tunis, analysts debated the quail phenomenon, but not everything was certain. Feed prices fluctuated, water sources strained, corporate interest grew louder, craftier, and the original contracts, the ones signed in secret, were never fully clarified. So the final question remained, fluttering like wings over the desert. Was this true sovereignty? Or was it just another dependency this time? Dressed in feathers, Captain Traoré, older now, but still commanding, stood once again before the nation. We did not promise perfection. He said, we promised progress, and the only way forward is together. The applause was not thunderous. It was steady. It was earned. And in villages across the land, people looked at their flocks, not as miracles, but as muscle, not as handouts, but as habits, not as symbols, but as systems. They had weathered hunger. They had faced ridicule. They had survived betrayal. And now they had survived disease. This was no longer a test. This was proof. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. The birds were still flying, and so was Burkina Faso. When small things change everything, what began as a punchline became a pillar. What they called a joke now feeds millions. 20 million fragile wings. Released, not for show, but for survival. From millet fields to desert sands. From village stalls to international markets. The Quail Revolution rewrote the story of what was possible, and yet, the final question still hangs in the air like dust at sunset. Who controls the food, controls the future. So who truly controls this revolution now? Are we watching a nation rise? Or watching another resource slip away, dressed in feathers and wrapped in profit? For mothers like Awa, for farmers like Salif, for the grandmothers in Dedougou and the children in Yako, the answer was never in a contract. It was in a basket of eggs, a full stomach. A child who no longer cries from hunger. But for the rest of us watching, reading, and wondering, we must ask, will the world allow Africa to own its solutions? Or will it always find a way to take them? Let that sit with you. And if this story opened your eyes, if it stirred something buried deep inside your soul, don't scroll past. Don't forget. Don't be silent. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thanks for coming. See you in the next video for news analysis, the truth they don't want you to know. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Burkina Faso, latest news. Let the world know. Africa rise.